You feel that shift in the air, that change in the tone of the conversation. That's not just noise. That's power moving. That's balance tilting. And the West, after centuries of sitting comfortably in the driver's seat, is starting to feel the rumble beneath them. Because India's rise, it's not a flicker, not a phase. It's deliberate, it's deep, and it's redefining what global power looks like. For a long time, the story of the world was told from one side. The West wrote the script, directed the action, and handed out the roles. Everyone else, they played their part, supporting roles, background characters, extras in someone else's vision of the future. But now, India is stepping into the frame, not as a follower, not as a carbon copy, but as a force. As a nation with its own voice, its own values, and its own vision. And that voice is getting louder, stronger, more confident every day. You see it in the boardrooms of Bengaluru, where tech minds are building platforms that power half the world's software. You see it in ISRO's Mission Control, where scientists put a lander on the moon's south pole on a budget smaller than a Hollywood blockbuster. You see it in rural India, where digital payment systems reach the last mile with a kind of efficiency even developed countries envy. This isn't just growth. This is transformation. But let's call it what it really is, a challenge, not to the people, not to peace, but to the system. The old system. A system where the rules were set without us in the room. Where decisions were made in conferences we weren't invited to. And now, as India rises, it's not just entering the game. It's rewriting the playbook. And that makes people nervous. Because when you've had power for so long, someone else gaining it can feel like losing it. You see, the panic isn't about economics alone. It's not just GDP charts and population stats. It's about control. It's about losing the ability to dictate the terms. India is becoming a center of gravity in a multipolar world. And that means the West isn't the only one calling the shots anymore. That balance of power is shifting eastward, and fast, and when you're used to being the sun, anything else that shines can feel like a threat. And here's the part that really stings. India isn't rising in the West's image. It's not asking for validation. It's not following a borrowed blueprint. It's rising as itself. Complex, messy, vibrant, unapologetically Indian. Rooted in its civilization, propelled by its youth, and shaped by its own contradictions. That kind of rise, that authentic rise, is harder to predict, harder to contain, and much harder to co-opt. So yes, the West is panicking, but it's not because India is rising. It's because India is rising differently. Not in imitation, but in assertion. Not to fit in, but to stand out. And maybe that's the point. It's not just about taking a seat at the table. It's about building your own table on your own terms. And when that table's set, when the world sits down for that next conversation, you better believe the voice from India won't be one they can ignore. For too long, the world was told in a single voice. One tone, one lens, one version of truth, carefully curated and broadcast from the same studios, boardrooms, and academic halls of the West. And for a while it worked. The West didn't just build narratives. They built belief systems about who was developed, who was developing, about what was modern, what was backward, about who saved and who needed saving. But that era, it's fading, because India is no longer waiting for someone else to tell its story. It's telling it for itself. Loudly, clearly, proudly, the change didn't happen overnight. But when it came like a wave. Social media, cinema, diplomacy, education. India isn't just participating, it's projecting. From RRR winning international acclaim, to Indian voices dominating global tech spaces, to a prime minister standing confidently beside world leaders and speaking not just for one country, but for an entire bloc of rising nations. This is a narrative shift with teeth, and it makes the old gatekeepers uneasy, because they no longer control the spotlight, and maybe they never really did. Maybe they just convinced the world they did. See, the West got used to defining everyone else. They labeled, measured, ranked, judged. They told us what freedom looked like, what success meant, and who the heroes were. But India is rejecting those labels. It's offering its own definitions, and that's what's unsettling, because once people start seeing with their own eyes, they stop accepting the borrowed view. Now, this narrative power, it's not just about prestige or pride. It's about control. If you can control how people see themselves, you can control how they behave. You can dictate terms, priorities, even dreams. That's why India telling its own story is more than symbolic, it's revolutionary. It challenges decades of conditioning, and when you challenge the story, you challenge the system behind it. But there's another layer to this, and it's even more urgent. It's the shift from dependence to independence, not just politically, but economically and technologically. And this shift, that's where the panic hits the hardest, because the West was comfortable when India was the back end, the cheap labor, the call center, the follower. But now, India is becoming the front end. The architect, the innovator, the origin point. Look at what's happening. India has one of the world's fastest growing startup ecosystems. It's producing unicorns faster than some Western economies. It's becoming a manufacturing alternative to China, not just because of low costs, but because of policy, innovation, and strategic alignment. And in tech, India isn't just consuming technology, it's building it. From homegrown payment systems that serve millions with zero transaction fees, to indigenous defense equipment and semiconductor strategies, India is preparing to stand on its own legs, and that's the problem for those who've benefited from India's dependence. If a country becomes self-reliant, if it stops importing not just goods but also ideas, then it starts making decisions that don't depend on foreign approval. It negotiates differently. It votes differently in global forums. It makes alliances that are uncomfortable for those used to having all the leverage. So when we say the West is panicking, it's not fear of aggression. It's fear of irrelevance. It's the fear of losing the monopoly on truth, on innovation, on leadership. Because once a nation like India rises with its own story and its own systems, the rest of the world starts thinking, maybe we can too. And that is the most powerful story of all. You can't mute 1 billion people. Not anymore. For decades, the world's largest democracy sat on the sidelines of global influence. Present, but rarely heard. Quiet, compliant, often dismissed as a future promise. Never quite a present force. But that silence is gone now, because India's voice, young, loud, ambitious, is rising, not in whispers, not in translation, but on its own terms. And the West, it's struggling to process what it means when a country that used to be a developing market starts acting like a global player, starts thinking like one, starts moving like one. This isn't just about population. Yes, India has the numbers, over 4 billion people, the youngest workforce on the planet. That alone would give any country leverage. But India's strength isn't just in how many people it has, it's in how connected they are. In the villages where smartphones outnumber toilets, in the cities where engineers dream in code and pitch startups with billion-dollar valuations. In classrooms where kids are learning not just English or math, but how to build solutions for problems the West hasn't even faced yet. This is not a passive rise. It's an active one, fueled by intention, driven by purpose. And here's the part that really shifts the ground. India is doing this while being democratic, while being messy, while being noisy, while dealing with its contradictions, not hiding them. And that makes it even harder for the West to discredit the rise. Because for all the talk about democracy and freedom, India is doing it within a framework that the West itself claims to uphold. It's not authoritarian. It's not a puppet. It's complex, yes, but it's legitimate. And that legitimacy means it's not so easy to brush aside, not so easy to lecture, not so easy to contain. What's happening now is the natural result of decades of underestimated potential finally finding its center. India is showing up in global forums not as a listener, but as a negotiator, as a leader. Whether it's climate agreements, trade talks, or digital governance, the country is beginning to demand, not just request, a say. And when India speaks, it's not just speaking for itself. It's speaking as a voice of the global South, for nations long ignored, for cultures long patronized. That scares a system built on the idea that only a few countries get to lead, while the rest follow. And make no mistake, the West's discomfort isn't just intellectual. It's strategic. Because India's rise puts pressure on every power structure that was designed with Western dominance at its core. It challenges the logic of alliances, the assumptions of development models, and the way influence has traditionally been measured. Military bases, corporate headquarters, Ivy League think tanks. India's power doesn't come from mimicking those. It comes from creating its own blueprint, and when others see that blueprint working, they start asking, why not us? That's the fear, that's the panic, not just that India is rising, but that it's inspiring. That it's proving a non-Western, pluralistic, imperfect yet determined path to prosperity is not only possible, it's real. And that kind of example spreads. That kind of example can't be stopped with sanctions or media spin. It doesn't need permission. It just needs momentum. So when India speaks now, the room listens, not because it has the most wealth or the most weapons, but because it has the weight of 1 billion people behind every word. People who have waited long enough to be seen, to be heard, and now, finally, are ready to lead. That time is no longer coming. That time is here. The world map isn't just a piece of paper with borders. It's a story of who stands where, who shakes hands with whom, and who gets left out of the conversation. And right now, that map is being redrawn. Quietly in some places, boldly in others. But one thing is clear. The old alliances aren't holding like they used to. New partnerships are forming. New centers of influence are emerging. And India is right in the middle of this realignment, not following orders, not playing sides, but charting its own course. That's not just unsettling for the West, it's unfamiliar territory. For decades, the world moved on a binary axis, East versus West, capitalism versus communism, allies versus enemies. You were in someone's camp or you were isolated. But India never really fit into those neat little boxes. It had its own way non-aligned, self-defined, and often inconvenient for those who preferred predictability over independence. Today, that independent streak is not just a diplomatic posture, it's a strategic power. Because India doesn't need to pick a side anymore, it is a side. And when that kind of balance enters global politics, the old powers feel the ground shifting beneath them. Take BRICS, for example. What once started as an economic acronym is becoming a geopolitical force. And India is one of its strongest voices, not echoing China, not opposing the West, but speaking on behalf of a global South that has long felt exploited, ignored, and lectured. That voice is now asking questions Western powers aren't used to answering. Why are the same few countries making the rules for global finance? Why do sanctions only flow in one direction? Why is development aid always a transaction, never a partnership? And it's not just about big alliances. It's about dozens of smaller shifts adding up to a larger wave. India is strengthening ties with Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. It's investing, trading, building infrastructure, exchanging technology, quietly inking deals where the West was either absent or arrogant. And that's how real power moves, not with declarations, but with relationships. Relationships that don't come with strings attached or lectures about values, but with mutual respect and long-term thinking. That's a threat to a system where influence has often been bought, not earned. Even India's relationship with the West is changing. It's not hostility, but it's not dependence either. It's pragmatism. India can engage in military exercises with the U.S., buy oil from Russia, trade with Europe, and lead forums with the global South, all in the same month. That kind of diplomatic flexibility confuses the old powers because it's not supposed to work that way. But it does, and it sends a clear message. India doesn't belong to anyone's axis. It belongs to itself. And let's be honest, this independence makes Western policymakers nervous, because they're used to dealing with either allies they can influence or adversaries they can isolate. But India is neither. It's cooperative without being compliant, friendly but firm, and that makes it hard to control, hard to predict, and even harder to sideline. Especially when it comes backed by a booming economy, a tech-savvy population, and a military that's growing in capability and confidence. So yes, the world is changing, but it's not chaos, it's correction. The rise of India is not a disruption. It's a restoration of balance in a world that was tilted too long in one direction. And as new alliances form, and old ones lose their shine, the West is realizing something uncomfortable. They're not the only ones at the table anymore, and they may not always get to sit at the head. That seat is being earned, not inherited. There's a deeper fear behind all the headlines, behind all the tank reports and anxious press conferences about India's growing role on the global stage. And that fear isn't just about economy or security. It's about identity. It's about what kind of power India is becoming, because this rise, it's not polished in Western style. It's not dressed up to look like a replica of Washington or Brussels or London. No, India is rising as India, and that's what truly shakes the foundation of the old order, because this time it's not about fitting in. It's about standing out. See, when other nations have risen in the past, the West found comfort in assimilation. You want to rise? Fine. Just follow our model. Embrace our politics, our institutions, our market systems, our cultural templates. Success was handed out with conditions. Mirror us and we'll let you in. But India, it's not mirroring, it's molding. It's taking what works, discarding what doesn't, and refusing to pretend it needs a Western stamp of approval to validate its progress. Look around. The symbols of India's rise aren't borrowed. They're rooted. Whether it's Chandrayaan landing on the moon's southern pole, or India's G20 presidency asserting global priorities from a distinctly Indian perspective, the message is clear. We are not here to imitate. We are here to contribute and to lead in our own language, in our own way. That's cultural confidence, and it makes the West uncomfortable, because cultural confidence can't be colonized. It can't be bought or bullied. It's a declaration that we don't just have history, we have future, and we're going to define it. The West got used to exporting not just goods, but ideals, democracy, capitalism, modernity, wrapped in a very particular package. Now, India practices democracy, sure, but not the way the West dictates. India builds markets, yes, but on a scale and with a model adapted to its own realities. And that's the point. India's success is disproving the idea that there's only one right way to develop, only one path to influence. It's showing that you can be pluralistic, messy, spiritual, tech-savvy, traditional, and futuristic, all at once, and still rise, That complexity defies every simplified narrative the West has leaned on for decades. And what does that mean for the global South, for the so-called developing world? It means they finally have an example of success that doesn't require cultural self-erasure. That's what's really powerful. That's what spreads faster than any ideology. Hope that you can grow without becoming someone else. That you can lead without speaking someone else's language, literally and figuratively. Now imagine what that does to Western dominance. Not military dominance, but cultural dominance, intellectual dominance, the kind of influence that shapes what success looks like in people's minds. If that grip loosens, if the world starts looking eastward, not just for factories and labor, but for thought, for leadership, for style, for direction, then the West loses the one thing it never wanted to admit it depended on, being the default. That's what's happening now. It's not loud, but it's deep. A civilizational shift, a reclamation. India isn't just building infrastructure or GDP, it's building self-definition. And that's why the panic isn't always obvious, but it's real. Because when you're used to everyone following your lead, the moment someone walks their own path and makes it work, you start to wonder who's really in control. And control, let's be honest, was never meant to be shared. There's a truth nobody likes to say out loud in the corridors of old power, but it hangs heavy in the air. The rules of the global order were never neutral. They were never truly fair. They were built by the winners of old wars, crafted to preserve dominance, designed to maintain a certain hierarchy. That's the system India is walking into now, but not quietly, not obediently, and that's what's triggering the unease. Because India isn't coming in to be a well-behaved participant. It's coming in to ask why the game was rigged in the first place. Let's be clear. This international order, this so-called rules-based system, was shaped at a time when much of the world, including India, was under colonial rule. It wasn't made with our voices in the room. It wasn't designed for our benefit. Bretton Woods, the UN Security Council, the G7. These were clubs formed when India was still fighting for its freedom. And today, even as a rising global economic power, India still doesn't have a permanent seat at the top tables. That's not an oversight, that's design. And that design is being questioned, challenged, and, slowly but surely, reshaped. India is refusing to play the role of the obedient rule-taker. It's starting to question who made these rules and who they benefit. Why should institutions that represent a post-World War Roman II world continue to dictate the fate of a 21st century reality? Why should countries with stagnant populations and declining influence hold more sway than a nation of one? 4 billion driving growth, innovation, and peacekeeping across the globe. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the West. India isn't just challenging the rules. It's offering alternatives. It's pushing for reforms at the United Nations. It's leading coalitions like the International Solar Alliance. It's giving loans, aid, and vaccine support to countries without demanding ideological loyalty in return. That's a different kind of leadership, a kind that doesn't replicate the old dominance model, but dismantles it piece by piece through action, not ideology. But understand this, India isn't anti-West. It's just not waiting for the West's permission anymore. That's the real disruption. This isn't a rebellion. It's a refusal to be relegated, a refusal to stay on the margins of a system built without us, for the benefit of others. And when that refusal starts echoing in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, then you don't just have a rising India, you have a rising world, one that's done being spoken for. And yet, what does the West often label this assertion as? Populism, nationalism, even illiberalism. But let's cut through the noise. What's really being defended here is the right to self-definition, the right to question who sets the agenda and who benefits from the status quo. And in doing so, India is not isolating itself. It's becoming a voice for those who have been locked out for too long. A voice that isn't afraid to say, we see the structure and we're not impressed. So yes, the panic is real. Because when a country like India not only enters the room but starts rearranging the furniture, defining power, partnership, and purpose, the old guard doesn't know whether to welcome it, resist it, or fear it. But the truth, they no longer get to decide alone. The era of single-handed leadership is over. What's coming now is a more contested, more complex, and more representative world order, and India intends to help shape it.